Hello my friends, welcome to my corner and welcome to the Borges Connection, episode number 2. Today we're going to look at Borges' first steps as a fiction writer. His first collection of short stories is probably the one that gets the least attention, so in my view that is a good reason to begin with it. I have read Historia Universal de la Infamia in English and also in Spanish. My first experience of it was in Spanish. For my Borges in Spanish, I have the editions published by Alianza Editorial, so they always look like this. And in English, you can find Historia Universal de la Infamia published as a separate volume, but you can also find it in the good old collected fictions published by Penguin. Now, in English, this is a collection that is known by two titles. It has been published as a universal history of infamy and as a universal history of iniquity. I'm going to favor the latter, okay? Unless, of course, I forget while I'm doing the video and I call it a different thing. But for the most part, I am going to refer to it as a universal history of iniquity. So first of all, I thought we would look at Borges' prefaces to this book to see what he says about it. In the first one, which is from 1935, which was the first edition of A Universal History of Iniquity, one thing he does is he tells us what authors influenced this book. He mentions Stevenson, he mentions G.K. Chesterton, the films of Joseph von Sternberg, and he also mentions a particular biography of the poet Evaristo Carriego. Now, you may not have heard of Evaristo Carriego because outside of Argentina, he is really not read at all. And even in Argentina, there are not many people who pay a lot of attention to his works, especially when you consider that he was a poet who was admired and mentioned many times by Borges. As a matter of fact, Borges wrote a full-length book on Evaristo Carriego, but he is a very important poet. Now, then Borges wrote in 1954 the second preface to A Universal History of Iniquity, and this is what he said about the stories or the texts that are included here. He says, "They are the irresponsible sport of a shy sort of man who could not bring himself to write short stories, and so amused himself by changing and distorting, sometimes without aesthetic justification, the stories of other men." That is wonderful, but Borges forgot, neglected, failed, or maybe did it on purpose, to mention the most important influence on this book, Universal History of Iniquity, and that is Imaginary Lives, Vies Imaginaires by Marcel Schwob. Now, I have already told you about this book literally a few days ago in the video that I did on it, so let me refer you to that video for details on this book, but I'm still going to tell you a little bit about it in this video in case you are just following the Borges Connection here. So Schwab's book is a delightful blend of fact and fiction. What this consists of is 22 biographical sketches of marginal characters, some of them more well known than others. And what Borges did was to follow pretty much the model or the example of Schwab's Imaginary Lives, but then he also used his own sources, and he in fact gives credit to these sources in A Universal History of Iniquity. Some of those sources, just to give you an idea, are Mark Twain, the Encyclopedia Britannica, Philip Goss, Herbert Asbury, The 1001 Nights, and there are many, many more. So one thing that I wanted to pause on shortly or briefly is the structure of the book, A Universal History of Iniquity, because it has a really interesting structure. It's a three-part structure. The first part is titled A Universal History of Iniquity, so that would be the book proper or the collection of the most important stories there. Then the second part is Man on Pink Corner, so you just have that one short story that makes up the second part of the book. And then finally we have the last section, the third one, which is titled Etcetera. And this one consists of 6 shorts that are also stories that were taken from other sources that Borges cites in the book. So generally speaking, what we have here are twice told tales, to borrow that title from Nathaniel Hawthorne, and that is what A Universal History of Iniquity is for the most part. So what do you say? Let's look at the contents here and the stories that are included in this book. I call them stories at this point, but I'm going to tell you a little bit more about genre towards the end of this video, because that is a very important aspect of the work. So we begin a universal history of iniquity with the story of the cruel redeemer, Lazarus Morel. This is the story of a man who began by stealing horses. What he would do was he would preach, he would pose as a preacher, and his accomplices would take the horses while he was preaching. But then eventually he came to do something even more horrible, which is to take advantage of slaves by promising them their freedom. So I mean, what a way to begin a history of iniquity with a character that is really, really low. In this case, the source is Mark Twain's Life in the Mississippi. So that's how the story begins, with a very good note, if you ask me. The second one is The Improbable Imposter, Tom Castro. And this one is about an imposter who, with the help of a friend, makes a lady believe that he is her son, whom she thought was dead. So we have the story of somebody pretending to be someone that he is not. So it's a great story of associated scoundrels. So because of that, it reminded me of the last story in Schwab's book, Imaginary Lives, which is the story of Burke and Hare. You have these murderers in that case, a different story here, who collaborated. So that's an association that I made. But the themes here are really important, because what we are talking about, what Borges is going into, is basically the nature of identity and how fluid that concept of the personal identity is. The question here is, what does it take to become somebody else? The source for this story of Tom Castro is the Encyclopedia Britannica, even though if you read the book, it is attributed to Philip Goss and his History of Piracy. So Borges either made a mistake or he was just playing with us, most probably. So that's what happened right there. Then we have the story of the Widow Ching, pirate. So interesting, because we have the story of a female pirate who is fighting the empire. In other words, we have the story of an outlaw figure. And this one really is from Philip Goss's History of Piracy. So the attribution is correct right there. Next we have Monk Eastman, Purveyor of Iniquities. This one is just fascinating. Okay, I loved this one, and I'm going to tell you the way I usually do. If you're going to sample this book, if you're going to read one of these sketches, make it the one on Monk Eastman. This one shows Borges's taste for enumeration and anaphora. So these are things that he got or that he learned from Walt Whitman, as he himself said on many occasions. And I think it's amazing how Borges can summarize. For example, in this case, he just brings to life the New York of those days through a list of the gangs that were operating at that time and their peculiarities. So it's really amazing how Borges can do that. Now, another interesting thing, especially if you're coming from a US perspective and from a film perspective, the source for this story of Monk Eastman was the book by Herbert Asbury that is also the source for Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York. That's the title of the book, as a matter of fact. And actually, there is a fictionalized version with a different name of Monk Eastman who appears in the film. So there's that added interest right there. But even without considering that, this is just a gem of storytelling. The next one is the disinterested killer Bill Harrigan, also known as Billy the Kid. So this is perhaps the most famous of the characters that Borges describes in this book, in this collection. And I would say that, you know, if I called the previous sketch, the one on Monk Eastman, the most fascinating, maybe the one on Billy the Kid, I would say, is the most effective. Because what we have here is a very brief text that is also very, very vivid. So I would call this text a good example of Borges's ability to be concise, for example. That is the term that I would use to describe his narrative art in this case. The Uncivil Teacher of Court Etiquette, Kotsuke no Suke. This is a story of the legendary 47 Ronin. You know, it's one of the most famous Japanese legends. It has been made into films by, for example, Kenji Mizoguchi, by Kon Ichikawa, and other directors. And the main theme of this one, as you might expect from the type of story that it is the concept of honor. And then to finish that first part of the book, we have Hakim, the Masked Dyer of Merv. This is by far the most exotic, I'm going to use that adjective, of the stories that are included in a universal history of Iniquity, and it is inspired by the 1001 Nights. It has that air. So that was another favorite of mine because, as you may know, I am a big enthusiast of the 1001 Nights. That is the first part of the book. Okay, so we come to the second part, which is composed by one short story, namely Man on Pink Corner. This is a very important story because it was the first quote-unquote real short story that Borges published. And it is about gauchos. And most of the time what that means is two themes, honor and death. Okay, gaucho stories are about that. Now this story, Man on Pink Corner, has an oral style. So many people who come from, for example, Ficciones or El Aleph, that experience of Borges, they may read the story and think, wow, this is kind of weird, right? Because it has that oral style. But the problem is, I think that for the most part, right, generally speaking, we have come to associate Borges with speculative fiction, with the stories that you may find in Ficciones or El Aleph. And we forget sometimes that gauchos are all over his work, are in his poetry, in his collections of stories. Borges was a really big enthusiast of literatura gauchesca, of gaucho literature. And in fact, he dedicated an entire book to the Martín Fierro, which is the national poem of Argentina. This book, by the way, was co-written with Margarita Guerrero. That needs to be said. You know, it wasn't only Borges who wrote it. But the point here is that this is something that is really present in Borges's work throughout. So Man on Pink Corner is not really an oddity in his work. So what is the story about? A stranger comes to town. He's looking for a guy by the name of Rosendo Juarez because he has heard that this Rosendo Juarez guy is a really tough man. Okay, so the stranger wants a fight. This is a typical scene in gaucho literature. We have this character who comes here, as we say in Argentina, buscando roña, right, looking for trouble, and most of the time he gets it. So in this story we have Borges as a character listening to the events from a person who was there, a witness to this event that took place, this guy coming into town looking for Rosendo Juarez. And this is interesting because in a later collection of short stories, Brody's Report, Borges would come back to this tale with the same characters. In that other collection, you're going to find a short story titled The Story from Rosendo Juarez. So you get his side of the story many years later to what happened in Man on Pink Corner. So it's part of the mythos, I would say, of Borges and his gauchos. And I think Man on Pink Corner, whatever you may think about the story when you compare it to others by Borges, is a very important story, not only because it was Borges' first real story, but because it is just one of his best. Okay, and I know here that Borges would disagree with me. He spoke disparagingly of this short story many times, but I think it's just wonderful because when you look at it, you look at the story Man on Pink Corner, and it doesn't seem like anything spectacular, but it is a story that has a lot of depth to it. It is engrossing and it is memorable. So no matter what Borges thought about it, I think this is one of my favorite short stories by him. So that takes us to the last part of this book, which is the one titled Etcetera. This is really nice because it is, I'm going to describe it in Argentine terms. It's what in Argentina we call a chapa. Okay, a chapa is like an added extra that is just given out of generosity. And as a matter of fact, la chapa is also a candy that we have that is amazing. It's very simple stuff. It's like a sugar-based candy. I think here in the US you have Necco drops or Necco wafers, I think it's called. So it's the equivalent of that, only with a different type of shape. But anyway, as I was saying, this is a chapa, right? You're reading the book, you're kind of sad that it's coming to an end, and all of a sudden you get this extra, just in case you wanted more. Let me read you the titles. These are the 6 shorts. So we have A Theologian in Death, The Chamber of Statues, The Story of the Two Dreamers, The Wizard That Was Made to Wait, The Mirror of Ink, and finally Muhammad's Double. I am a big fan of the little piece titled The Story of the Two Dreamers. This is from the 1001 Nights, and as a matter of fact, I read this story for you in a video that I did a very long time ago, almost 2 years ago, if I am not mistaken. So if you want to hear it from this corner, I invite you to check out that video. But I also really liked the piece that comes after that one, which is The Wizard That Was Made to Wait. This one was just delightful, and it is from the book El Conde Lucanor, which is known here as Libro de Patronio by Don Juan Manuel. That is a classic of Spanish literature that gets virtually no attention in the English-speaking world, unless, of course, you're taking one of those surveys of Spanish literature in Spanish at the college level or something like that. So that is a delightful book, and I'm going to tell you about it at some point because it's one of my favorites also from Spanish literature. It's the equivalent of the Canterbury Tales or the 1001 Nights for the Spanish-speaking world. Another equivalent would be the Decameron in Italy. So I really, really liked that story. And then I also enjoyed The Mirror of Ink. This one made me think of a Japanese movie titled Kwaidan. It's a classic. It was nominated for the Academy Award many years ago, I believe. And it's a very interesting film by Masaki Kobayashi because it is a 4-part film. So you get 4 short stories from the collection Kwaidan by Hearn, that famous book. And the last one is titled In a Cup of Tea. And it is also about a reflection. So let me also invite you to watch that movie Kwaidan, and especially that last part that perplexes many people. And that is Borgesian in itself, right? The perplexity that you have to deal when you're experiencing some of these texts, or in this case, this little film. So I want to add a note here about genre. Okay, we should talk about genre when we're discussing Borges, because I read A Universal History of Iniquity as fiction, but other people might tell you, well, it's not really fiction. We could also look at this book as a very good example of creative nonfiction, because we are dealing with real characters and the retelling of their story in a creative way. It can also be a work of nonfiction, period, right? So you have many options, and whether this is a book of fiction is really an open question. But what I wanted to say was this mainly, that the issue of genre is really a complex one all the time, but especially when you're talking about Jorge Luis Borges, because some of his most famous stories, as you know, could be considered fictional book reviews or even creative essays. So where do you stand when it comes to genre when you're talking about Borges? So I believe that in this case of the Universal History of Iniquity, the ambiguity of genre is actually one of the things that make this book an amazing reading experience, because you ask yourself, and in a good way, not in a bad way, as tends to happen most of the time, what kind of book is this when you're done reading it? And I think in this case, that's a good question to ask. I really love eccentric texts that are difficult to categorize and to file under a certain label. So this is definitely one of those. Now, Universal History of Iniquity is the Borges collection that probably the critics have paid the least attention to. And Borges himself, whenever he got the chance, spoke of it in disparaging terms. I'm going to share with you something that he said. I have here with me Jorge Luis Borges, A Study of the Short Fiction by Naomi Lindstrom, which includes a little interview towards the end of the book. And here Borges says, "The Historia Universal de la Infamia is written in a Baroque style, but it was done as a kind of a joke, you see. A not very amusing joke, but in short, I couldn't think of anything else to write." And he adds, "The Historia Universal de la Infamia was written by a beginner, and El Aleph was written by a man with some literary experience and who was mature enough to stop playing certain games and to stop indulging in certain kinds of mischief or pranks." I like those words, games, pranks, this idea that he didn't know what else to write, and that's why he wrote these stories. But I think at the same time it's important to remember that Borges was quite harsh, especially in later years, when it came to his first books. There are actually 3 books that he completely repudiated. I'm talking about Inquisiciones. That's why you have other Inquisitions. There was an Inquisitions before, but he repudiated that book. El Idioma de los Argentinos and El Tamaño de mi Esperanza. Am I going to tell you about them? Of course, my friend, unless of course something happens to me. But putting that aside, I'm gonna do my best to share some ideas with you on those books because I think they are very interesting. But the point here is, I don't think we need to be as harsh on these books, especially on A Universal History of Iniquity, as Borges himself was. So that is my opinion on that issue. Bottom line. A Universal History of Iniquity may not be Borges's most important or even most fascinating narrative collection of stories, but I think it's an essential work because it allows us to understand his development as a writer of fiction. And at the very least, it's a book that lets you see, how the mature Borges was beginning his career. So you can see where that mature Borges, the one that we all love from the Ficciones and El Aleph, was coming from. And something that I got this time when I read it is the fact that this collection of stories attests to something that I greatly, greatly admire Borges for, and that I actually envy him for, which is namely just the lack of anxiety of influence that he had. I mean, if there were a prize to the author with the least anxiety of influence, I'm pretty sure that Borges would be the winner, because he seemed to have no anxiety of influence whatsoever. And this is something that keeps so many writers from developing their own work. And I think I identify with that kind of situation. It's something very difficult to get through. And Borges had no problem with that. He began with a book that he was saying, look, these are stories that come from someplace else. And I think that is just amazing. And it really is something that is inspiring to me also. I would not start with A Universal History of Iniquity if I were new to Borges. Okay, so I'm going to say that. I would probably read Ficciones first. That's always a safe step. Or the El Aleph, that's another one that you could begin with. And the one that I experienced first, my first experience of all the works of Jorge Luis Borges, was The Book of Sand. And here I am. I have read all of by Borges that I could get my hands on, all of his official books. So it didn't turn out badly for me, okay, if I started with The Book of Sand. So any of those options are good. I believe I read The Book of Sand and then I read A Universal History of Iniquity, and it was only after that that I read Ficciones. But of course I didn't really know what I was doing. I was kind of guiding myself through the works of Jorge Luis Borges. So that's how I did it. So those were my 2 cents on A Universal History of Iniquity. Please let me know if you have any questions, comments, recommendations, or recipes. As always, I'm happy to reply. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.